Right now I'd like to bring up Dr. Fred Pearson, longtime MCHR board member and the director of the Peace and Conflict Center at Wayne State University. And he's going to introduce our speaker for today, Fran Shor.
I might note that I inherited my role with MCHR from Lillian Genzer, who established it as a permanent commitment by the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, which we treasure to this day and going forward. By the way, Brenda mentioned our collaboration this past year about a study tour in Michigan with Dorothy and MCHR. Which took our Ralph Bunche Institute students. Every year we commemorate the great legacy of Ralph Bunche in our community. Sometimes we forget that he's a cohort of Martin Luther King and our local icon. And we took the students this past time to Idlewild in the upper regions of Lower Peninsula, the great historic location for African American gathering from throughout the Midwest, sort of our version of the Borscht Belt, if you will, where you can't go anywhere else, you go there, as it was in New York for Jews. At any rate, on the way, of course, we stopped and we saw the Jim Crow Museum at Ferris State University. And if any of you have not seen that exhibit, it is really, really profound. It's in the basement of the library there. It's not the most easily found place, but it's really worth seeing and going to that. Founded by one of their professors who is now an administrator who collected these awful memorabilia from all over the country for years. So the students really got an eyeful and tremendously moved by that experience. So Dorothy, thank you for that as well. You have connections everywhere, certainly in Idlewild with your cohorts. We really enjoyed meeting them and seeing that area, which is still, still vibrant in its own way of history. Well, speaking of that, speaking of history, our colleague Fran Shor, who is way too young to retire, clearly, and thank goodness is just tremendously active still, is going to be our speaker today. And Fran continues to pioneer in new directions of social justice scholarship. He is, of course, a veteran of the programs at Wayne, like ours, which do social justice work from multidisciplinary perspectives. And he was very closely engaged with the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies until Wayne, in its inimitable fashion, did away with that program, just as it did with its Urban Studies College. Why would we need that in Detroit? We've offered perhaps some conflict resolution training to the university at the moment. I think it could use it, but we haven't been reciprocated on that yet. At any rate, Fran is certainly a veteran of those efforts to continue to keep intellectual curiosity from multiple perspectives alive. And he has ended up in the history department, of course, and much of his work is historical. He's written books that are very interesting these days. One on the new civil rights movement, as he puts it, in the so-called post-racial era a couple of years ago. And then he's also done things on American imperialism and its continuing efforts about hegemony, which we don't even know what to make of these days. It's an interesting point of contention as to whether we're still hegemonic or whether we're out of it all. At any rate, Fran has informed us on those things, and his latest, of course, endeavor is on what he conceives of, and I think it's a very pertinent way of looking at it, as the weaponization of white supremacy. Not just white supremacy, but the weaponization of white supremacy. And I think that's what he wants to deal with today in his address for us. So I'm very anxious to hear this, Fran. And thanks for the continuing good work, Fran Shor.
All right. First of all, thank you, Fred, for the introduction, and thanks to MCHR and everybody who's shown up today. And I am particularly humbled to be here at the same time that this award has been given to Dorothy. I have to tell you that, and some in here know this because they were with me when we did our MCHR tour on the 50th anniversary of Mississippi Freedom Summer. And when we were in both Mississippi and Alabama, I don't think there was a person that Dorothy didn't know. I mean, it was absolutely astounding. We'd go into these little restaurants, you know, and like people would know her and say hello to her, and you know, it's like, oh, okay. So not only did her reputation precede her, it's obviously her work and her long activity, which I'm so glad has been honored by MCHR today. And I want to add my admiration and thanks to you, Dorothy, for all your work. The second thing I want to do before I start is acknowledge that where we are is actually on Anishinaabe territory and Ojibwe territory. And we inhabit a region that has a long history of what I wrote about and what I'll be talking about today, of institutionalized white supremacist terror. It was a process of accumulation by dispossession, the building up of profit by expelling and even more exterminating the indigenous people. And what I'll talk about is in the coming of what was known as war capitalism. There also emerged at the same time in the 17th century racial capitalism. And one led to accumulation by dispossession, and the other led to accumulation by possession, actually commodifying people in brutal slave labor camps, as Ed Baptist says in his absolutely essential book On the Other Half Never Told. So what I want to try to talk about is, and to make sense of, is understanding the long history of white supremacist institutionalized terror. Acknowledging, of course, that over time, material conditions have changed, and over time, resistances by people of color in particular have helped to at least dismantle some of those institutional forms of white supremacy. Nonetheless, as we're well aware, we have in the White House today a vigilante in chief who actually stirs up this kind of white supremacist resentment and fueling the kind of politics that really can only be talked about as white identity politics of a kind of aggressive form. So I want to try to differentiate, though, between what has been a vigilante approach to white supremacist terror and an institutionalized approach. So in doing that, I also want to talk specifically about two different forms in which institutionalized white supremacist terror has a long history. One is in the making of war. And I think we need to understand that this has been, since its inception and even before, a warrior culture. I don't think we acknowledge that enough. And one of the great histories that was incorporated into the book that I just finished was a book by Jane Leite on the 50-year war against the Apache Nation in the Southwest. And she basically says the United States was created, manufactured, promoted through this kind of warfare. And so it's been very rare that there hasn't been a year without war making. And war making in particular has also been connected to the imposition of this kind of institutionalized white supremacist terror that I want to talk about. In addition to that, and alongside of it, although emerging in a later form, is the idea of policing. So I want to talk both about policing as a vehicle of white supremacist institutionalized terror and war making as a vehicle for that also. And I'll just emphasize, you can see from the quotes that I have up here, the relationship of war and policing, but also is vigilantism, as Catherine Ballou has pointed out, should be understood as violence that serves to constitute, shore up, and enforce systematic power. That is not only overt power wielded by the state, by many informal structures that upheld law and order. And oftentimes what one can see is there is an iron fist, as one can call it, a metaphoric iron fist of war policing, but there's also what might be called the invisible hand, the so-called market approach, which Richard Rothstein, in his incredible book on the color of law, talks about how housing policy, various forms of segregation, has created this kind of situation where daily violence is actually embedded in how people have to live their lives and struggle under the system of a white power structure. So to move ahead, and again, just to try to situate this. So what I'm trying to do is to talk about the long history of white supremacy and what is sometimes referred to as the racial state. And so this is my own way of, although incorporating a lot of other theoretical material. So as a socio-historical process of domination and control, white supremacy materialized as a racial formation that informed both the structures and subjectivities of the dominant and dominated. That's a lot of academic talk. But fundamentally what it's all about, it means that when you look at how power has been appropriated by particular racial groups or disadvantaged in ways that put people at risk, what we see is white supremacy is a racial formation, and it achieves its power, its dominance, through a variety of mechanisms, through socioeconomic, political, and cultural practices. And in those in particular, terror has been essential for that. There's also work that's been done on a racial state and what constitutes a racial state. And I think, this goes through what we, even up to the contemporary period, we like to think that, well, Jim Crow was defeated, segregation was defeated, and now we're stuck in colorblind racism, which is actually the liberal version of the white supremacist rhetoric that comes out of the White House. So we need to really pierce those forms of white supremacy and better understand how we go unpacking this history. So unpacking this history, starting with the process by which Native peoples were at the risk of losing their land to an ever emerging white civilization mission. And the notion of a civilizing mission was constructed around the sense that those people are savages, they have really no culture to provide, and therefore just moving ahead and expropriating their land is actually a way of rooting civilization, albeit that's a white civilization. Now, this, I don't know how well you can see this, comes from a rather controversial yes, Washington High School in San Francisco. This was painted during the 1930s. This was painted as a counter-narrative by a left-wing muralist who worked with Diego Rivera. But in the 60s, this also has a couple of other panels on enslaved people. And in the 60s, of course, one of the things that was really important was people developing a sense of agency, their own ability to say, we're not just victimized by history, we are makers of history. And so there was some sense that this might not be the best way of representing history, but in contemporary terms, there's been a struggle around whether or not to allow this mural to remain. And so one of the reasons is, you can't really see it that well, but there's a Native American on the ground. There's George Washington pointing to, I suppose, moving into the Northwest Territories, to the Northwest Ordinance, where we are surrounded by essentially the legacy of Indian killers. One of them, most famously, Lewis Cass, right there on Cass Avenue. We've got a lot of renaming and owning up to our own history. The Pequot War was the first, in a sense, of extermination efforts, and it became part of the mythology of the American frontier, in effect. If we can move on. So you get the myth of what's called savage war. And this is a long thread that you can see that runs right from these early wars against Native peoples right into Vietnam, right into Iraq in the present day. And I think with Richard Slotkin in particular talks about the way that creates a kind of mythology, the savage war being that some races are less civilized than others and therefore deserve to be eliminated. And I think one of the things that we're now still trying to come to grips with is the whole policy of what was known as Indian removal, the dark night of, as Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz calls him, of Indian removal, was Andrew Jackson. And isn't it surprising that Donald Trump's favorite president is Andrew Jackson? And here was Jackson finding the ideological cover to talk about the extermination of Native peoples. By persuasion and force, they have been made to retire from river to river and from mountain to mountain until some of the tribes have become extinct and others have left but remnants to preserve for a while their once terrible names, surrounded by the whites with their arts of civilization, which by destroying the resources of the savage doom him to weakness and decay. And I think, what this meant was tens of thousands of Native peoples being wiped out. The most brutal, of course, was in the Trail of Tears, where in 1838 over 8,000 Cherokee died after being forced out of the detention camps they had been pushed into. And in California, this wasn't just in the frontier territory here in what was then the Southwest, but here's another name that we have to contend with, Leland Stanford, Stanford University. Leland Stanford was one of those transplants from the East who helped to underwrite what were called Indian hunting expeditions, where they literally wiped out tens of thousands of Native peoples in California. And recently, finally, the governor of California has called this what it was, genocide, and apologized for it, but I don't think the reparations have been forthcoming. Okay, well, part of the continuing mythology is the Texas Rangers. Now remember, some of you may be old enough, or most of us look like we're old enough. There used to be a program about the Texas Rangers on television, as there was a program about Davy Crockett, who participated in the war against the Creeks. So a lot of this mythology is still has to be, I think, a little bit pierced. And when you think of what the Texas Rangers were, they were originally a vigilante force. Their targets were primarily Native peoples and Tejanos, the Mexican residents of Texas. Their goal, according to historian Gary Anderson, was to spread terror so that native neighboring groups would leave. In other words, you create such a fear because of the terror that's being practiced that people have to flee for their lives. And this is really important, and this we're only now beginning to understand how that also was part and parcel of the history of African Americans. I don't know how many people watch this program called The Watchmen. It is really one of the most radical efforts I've ever seen on television, because what it does is it starts by talking about the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. And Tulsa was just one of many. Just there's a recent book called Blood at the Root, which is about Georgia and about the terrorizing of African American communities in parts of Georgia. And this goes through, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of them. So here are, during the Mexican War, the Texas Rangers, packing multiple weapons, sporting bushy beards and colorful outfits, committed atrocity after atrocity. So much so that General Zachary Taylor, the commander of the invading Gringo army, that was the, it may be an apocryphal story, but the reference to Gringo, I think, comes from what was then a popular song that the soldiers would sing, "Green grow the lilacs, all covered with dew." I think that's where the name may come from. You can check Wikipedia or someplace more exact for that. But even General Zachary Taylor said that he thought these mounted men from Texas took delight in inflicting gratuitous violence on even unarmed Mexicans. And of course, this throughout the rest of the 19th century, ending up in what was probably one of the worst forms of massacre, the Wounded Knee Massacre. And I think what's particularly disgusting about this is that in Wounded Knee, this was just an extension of what had been the continuing dispossession of Native peoples. This was the site on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation of where Native peoples were beginning what was known as the ghost dance, which was a cultural revitalization movement to which most of white civilization had no sympathy or no tolerance. So US troops were sent in to break up the ghost dance. They fired on peaceful groups of people. They killed at least over 300 men, women, and children here. They're burying them. And some soldiers who were participated in this massacre got medals for their bravery. Eventually, I think, again, in 1990, it took a little while. People understood that this was a horrific incident. In fact, there was a resolution passed by Congress about deep regret for the massacre, no compensation. And this happened, of course, while President George H.W. Bush is engineering a military invasion of Panama, leading to another massacre almost a century later of 3,000 poor Panamanians. So the contradictions and the hypocrisy continue. By the way, I think that often in our hidden history of the very people who we know on one plane, it's shocking to find out something about them on another plane. I'm sure you're all familiar with the name of L. Frank Baum, Wizard of Oz. Well, Frank Baum was a newspaper reporter in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and wrote about the Wounded Knee Massacre and said, "Our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians." Dorothy and Toto would not be happy about that. I can't believe, And of course, in 1973, again at Pine Ridge, there was another standoff with the same sort of insensitivity promulgated by this time the FBI, and of those who were involved even at the fringes. One of those still languishing in prison to this day is the Native American activist, the American Indian activist, Leonard Peltier. If continue on, I think another way of understanding this is that these images, the constructions of what is seen as the fight against uncivil people, racialized others, was particularly evident in the war in the Philippines in 1899 to 1902. And on one hand, you get in this graphic that was from Harper's Weekly, a Asiatic appearance of people in the Philippines being righteously cut down by Uncle Sam and by William McKinley, president at the time. But at the same time, the rank and file soldiers, for many of those in the officer class, they referred to Filipinos as Indians. Now this would continue, right, through the Vietnam War, where they talked about Indian country, where the NLF was identified, the National Liberation Front was identified as Indian country. But the rank and file of the soldiers talked about the native Filipinos using the N-word because that was the racialized other that was necessary to, at the time, with white supremacy rampant in the United States. That was part of this struggle. Next, of course, is the connection which remains to this very day. The policy of Donald Trump and Stephen Miller on the border is, again, calling up that long history of xenophobia and white supremacist panic. This is from a 1903 graphic. I don't know how well you can see the riffraff of immigrants coming in. Remember, Trump talks about the criminals and rapists, and this is the way they were portrayed too back then, because the danger of American ideas and institutions is going to be inundated by this flood of others. And these others often included people who eventually gained white status, namely my grandparents, and many of those who came from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. Next, yeah. So to go back just for a second to talk about white supremacist terror in wars and policing. So there's this long history, this arc that connects the Indian Wars to the Gulf War. There's a long arc that connects the way in which whiteness has been conceived. That is about separating out what are considered to be threats. And on one hand, you see the My Lai massacre to the left. And on the other hand, I don't know how many people saw what happened a little while ago in Texas with this African American who was being led by a rope down the street. Now, again, the subversive, if you get a chance to watch Watchmen, and last week, the subversive quality of Watchmen was that this hooded vigilante called Hooded Justice, who has a rope around his neck, is actually African American who's wiping out the Klan through vigilante action. And it's kind of interesting to see how subversive that is. So I think most people who have studied what happened during the period of the enslavement of people of African descent, understanding that the slave patrols that emerged as ways of keeping enslaved African Americans in these slave labor camps was a form of a template for policing. And in particular, as the Sublets point out in this incredible book called The American Slave Coast, guns and slavery were intimately associated with each other. All slave raiding relied on guns, and all slaveholding relied on armed repression. And so you had the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan in the period of the Reconstruction period, and then its reemergence in the 1920s. And when it reemerged in the 1920s, it reemerged not just in the South as a way of putting down African Americans, but it reemerged in the state of Indiana, where it was preeminent, the state of Oregon, where it was preeminent, and in the city of Detroit, where it had almost a mayoral candidate hold office. And it would persist through the war years, through the hate strikes in places like the Packard plant in Detroit, with this kind of white supremacist attitude. To go back to this period, the KKK and the White League, there were numerous places around the country where these armed vigilantes would go in and literally wipe out African American communities. In Colfax, Louisiana was one of them in 1873. And what happened was some of the people participating in this vigilante action were actually brought up on charges. But when their case went to the Supreme Court reversed their convictions in the effort to continue to uphold white supremacy as an operation, a daily operation. Continuing. And one thing that I think, again, to talk about that Greg Grandin does so well in his book is when you think about the Border Patrol, this happens 1924 when the Border Patrol is established. It's the same year that Congress passed restrictive legislation, essentially preventing most of the Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and others from the Middle East, from Asia, from coming into the country. It isn't until 1965 when this restrictive immigration policy is overturned. But at the same time that restrictive immigration policy is being imposed, you have the construction then of the Border Patrol along the southern border, made up of many people who were active in the Ku Klux Klan. So that the terror that was part, and we now know and we see as part of the Border Patrol, it has a long history. The Border Patrol was often called, more recently, has been kind of a cult of brutality and a frontline instrument of race vigilantism. This vigilantism continued in the South, but not only in the South. I mean, you go in 1943 in Detroit, the race riot in Detroit, African Americans are hauled off of streetcars and beat up. But here in places like Mississippi, it was a terror state, a white terror state. Every institution in the state reinforced this process of white terror. At least through the late 1960s, white men could murder blacks and their allies, particularly in the South, without fearing any meaningful retribution, since the state shared some responsibility for racial violence of that era. And the unwillingness of juries to convict shows that many whites understood that upholding the racial status quo necessitated turning a blind eye to murder. Now, it would take a number of times later. These trials, and I talk about this in one of the chapters of my book, these trials in the 90s would finally find Byron Della Beckwith, who murdered Medgar Evers would find a number of other people who responsible for the murders of civil rights activists during the 60s, would finally find them guilty and send them to prison. But it still is a struggle. Still certainly, as I talk about with the struggle over these Confederate monuments in the South that were built to reinforce white supremacy. That taking them down is all about the sense of understanding the past. But it wasn't just in the South. If we can, some of you remember this very well. Some of you in this room fought against it. And some of you were here in 1973 when Coleman Young rode to political victory on the basis of the kind of mass mobilization that had happened to counter stress. For those of you who were not here, stress was stop the robberies, enjoy safe streets, but none if you're African American. Since the first years of its existence in the early 70s, there was at least one, on average, one African American male killed each month by stress. And this didn't happen just in Detroit. In Chicago, there was another stress-like organization that operated right up through the contemporary period. In fact, there were people, cops, who had been involved in the counterinsurgency campaigns in Vietnam, who participated then in the campaigns of not just violence, but also torture of African American, of young African Americans. What's happened, of course, and this is to some extent an unfortunate graphic because it tends to focus on what seems to be, the less educated and angry white men of the South. But what's happened is these laws have been passed at the behest of the National Rifle Association, with the control of these gerrymandered state legislatures in places around the country. And they are building on the castle doctrine of protecting your castle, supposedly, from invaders. But it's really about hauling off and anytime one is disturbed, using a weapon to shoot down often a racialized other. Now, it has been the case, thank goodness, that some of these people who have shot unarmed men unarmed black men have been brought to trial and found guilty. But we still haven't had any acknowledgement of punishment for those who killed Ayanna Jones in invading her house. And so, we have a long road ahead of us, I think, if you can. And again, I think one of the things that we now understand is maybe while the white supremacist vigilante terror doesn't still have the same institutionalized footing as it previously had, it nonetheless has an even more extensive global network. And social media has provided that, so that the very person who massacred those who were going to prayers in the mosques of Christchurch had ties with those in the United States. This is pictured in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life Synagogue, where my cousins were members, but were not there the day that the event happened. But remember the person who committed this act of violence against unarmed people. That person was basically also angered by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, to which the congregation was committing some funds, because they've been very foremost in promoting refugees and allowing, trying to continue a tradition of the United States being a refuge as the, since what is quickly being marginalized Statue of Liberty, and the poem by Emma Lazarus says, give me your tired, your poor, your hungry masses yearning to be free. The next, and of course, we continue to have to deal with racist police murders. It's no exaggeration to say, as Kamatha Taylor writes, that the men and women in blue patrolling the streets of the United States have been given a license to kill and demonstrated a consistent propensity to use it. More often than not, police violence, including murders and attempted murders, is directed at African Americans. And the case of Tamar Rice, a 12-year-old young African American in Cleveland, who is shot down by a white police officer who jumps out of his car and, without any warning whatsoever, in 2 seconds shoots down Tamar Rice. That white officer was not brought up on charges, and eventually left the Cleveland police force, but is now a police officer in a small town in Ohio. Sometimes these things continue because, again, I think we need to reemphasize that as people in active movements have, that Black Lives Matter, that as Robin Kelly points out, they remind us not only that Black Lives Matter, that should be self-evident, but that resistance matters. It matters because we are still grappling with the consequences of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and patriarchy. And some of those resistances continue, right? Standing Rock. Nick Estes, the Native American activism, says, Standing Rock is just an extension of the 100 years wars against Native people. And of course, what the state of North Dakota did, what the National Guard did up there, what the police forces did to peaceful indigenous peoples struggling against the violation of their lands, the violation of their water, was pretty horrific. But there was a moment, and I don't know how many of you saw this, there was a moment when white veterans of the military actually came to Native peoples and apologized. It was a very moving ceremony, a very powerful one too, because of not just the symbolism, because of the way in which the necessity of acknowledging, recognizing this history and connecting along those lines is really important. And of course, this white supremacist terror is now most represented at our border on the south. Criminalizing refugees, using the racist language of xenophobia and white supremacy, which had been part and parcel of the construction of national identity. Natasha Leonard pointed out in a 2018 article, Trump's immigrant policy is a matter of white supremacist social engineering aimed at excluding and decimating poor, predominant, non-white immigrants. And you can see these overcrowded detention centers in Texas in July 2018, which one visiting doctor said could be compared to torture facilities. And again, this isn't only a policy at its most horrific and most terror element, it's certainly Trump's. But this goes back to Bill Clinton, who signed a law that introduced mandatory detentions for asylum seekers. It goes back to Barack Obama, who deported almost 3 million refugees and asylum seekers. And so this is, again, something I think we need to think about, how we build that solidarity and what that means for us to recall and to really wrestle with the history of war, the history of policing, the history of xenophobia, and the way in which that we really have to contend with, as Timothy Tyson says, I want to just read this one quote from his most recent book on Emmett Till. Tyson writes, "To see beyond the ghosts, all of us must develop the moral vision and political will to crush white supremacy, both the political program and the concealed assumptions. We have to come to grips with our own history, not only genocide, slavery, exploitation, and systems of oppression, but also the legacies of those who resisted and fought back and still fight back." Thank you.